Let's learn in this video how to use CoreDNS in a Kubernetes cluster to set up custom domain names. Our objective here is to replace the default .service.kubernetes local with a custom domain like mydomain.com. Let's see how this works. Make sure to subscribe to my channel to get the latest videos about Kubernetes. CoreDNS is an open source tool available on GitHub, written in the Go language, and it supports lots of systems. So it has a large number of plugins. So from this list here, we can view plugins available for Azure, for some other cloud providers, for AWS, for GCP, and of course, plugins also available for Kubernetes and some other plugins that will be plugged into the CoreDNS system itself. CoreDNS is the main service discovery tool used in Kubernetes. Previously, Kubernetes used the kubeDNS, but then it was replaced by CoreDNS. CoreDNS is already installed in a Kubernetes cluster. If we check the pods, the services, and the maps that have the label Kubernetes app equal kubeDNS, and yes, it's called CoreDNS, but we still use that old label kubeDNS. From here, we'll see the pods that will be deployed in kubeDNS, and those pods actually are deployed when you have your cluster. So if you are using AKS, you will see those pods already installed or pre-installed in your cluster. You will see also the service for kubeDNS, and it's using here 10.0.0.10. So that's the UDP service or the route 53 that is used in order to resolve the domain names within the cluster. So all the services that are created inside the cluster would be resolved through this CoreDNS. CoreDNS will use also config maps in order to set up some custom configuration. So the config map used by CoreDNS, actually we have two. We have the basic config map or the main config map that is called CoreDNS, and we have a second one called the CoreDNS-custom, and this one is available for the users to be able to customize their CoreDNS configuration. In this example, I'm providing a rewrite stop rule that will go to map to a custom domain name. When I deploy that config map, and then if I go to nslookup for that custom domain, let's say it's nginx.default.aks.com. So this is resolvable within my cluster. That will take me to this private IP address for my service that I have exposed. And that service actually is the same service that could be found if I use the nginx.default.sbc.cluster.local, which is the default naming convention for the services in a Kubernetes cluster. And note here, they both use that same private IP. So from now on in my services or on my applications and my pods, I can use this custom domain name and it will be resolvable only within my Kubernetes cluster. Let's see a demo on how this works. For the lab for CoreDNS to set up custom domain names, I have provided in this GitHub repo all the source code files and the scripts that we'll be using today. So switch here to my VS Code and to my command line, where here what we want to achieve is that we want to be able to resolve some custom domain names inside my Kubernetes cluster using CoreDNS. So note here the domain name I'm using here, nginx.default.aks.com. That's going to be actually my custom domain name that will be resolvable only from within my Kubernetes cluster. So here for this lab, I have actually created an AKS cluster. So from here, if I go to do kubecontrol get nodes, then I will get the nodes in my cluster, and kubectl or the CoreDNS is already installed in my cluster. So if I do kubecontrol get pods, and then if I get also the service, the config map from within the kube system namespace and using the label app equal kube-dns, from here I will see two pods running my CoreDNS, and I have a service called kubeDNS, and note that service have the IP address 10.00.10. That's the IP address that will be used in order to resolve the service names within my Kubernetes cluster, and it is using the 53 port number, which is specific for DNS servers. And then we have two config maps. One is the main config map that is called CoreDNS, and a second one called CoreDNS-custom. If you want to customize any configuration in the CoreDNS, then we would be using the CoreDNS-custom. For CoreDNS, we should not change it actually, because it will be managed by the AKS service provider. We can actually go to take a look into that config map for the main config file, which contains right here some config rules like the 53 port number and its configuration for resolving the different service names. Next, in my demo, I have already created a deployment called nginx that will use the nginx image with replica equal 3. Then I have exposed that deployment to a service called nginx on the port number equal 80. And so now if I get the deployment and the services, I see that I have my deployment with the 3 pods running and a service called nginx. Now I will go to resolve that domain name for that nginx service. So for that, I'll go to create a new pod called nginx for testing, and then I'll go to exec into that pod using the kube control exec, and then the name of the pod -it, then --curl, and then I'll go to try to connect to it using http://nginx. That's the name of the service, and here because I'm in the same namespace, so I should be able to connect to that service. And that's similar actually to using the full service name, like here http nginx.default.svc.cluster.local. But now, instead of using this default service name, I want to use a custom domain name for this service. So let's do that. So to do that here, I'll go to use the custom CoreDNS config map in here, where I have that definition and its namespace, and then here inside the data section, I'll be using .override in order to rewrite stop rule, where I'll go here to define the name as regex, and here note I'm using this regex that uses aks.com, and then that will go actually to be used instead of the svc.cluster.local. So anything that will go into aks.com will be mapped into svc.cluster.local. So let's go to deploy this config map and let's see how it works. So I'll do kube control apply -f, then the name of that custom CoreDNS.yaml file. Once it's configured, we can view its configuration. So if I do kube control describe, then the name of that custom config map, from here I can view my rewrite rule right here. That will go to aks.com. And note here I have one that was commented because I'll use it later in this demo. Now with that custom config map, or with that custom CoreDNS configuration, I can go to resolve the name service of my service using the custom domain, which is aks.com. So I can go hit enter, but here doesn't work. I get an error, and this is normal actually, because when I change the configuration of that custom CoreDNS config map, I should restart the CoreDNS pods. And in order to do that, I'll just go to use kube control, delete, then those pods using their label names. So I'll delete the pod from the namespace kube system that have the label Kubernetes app equal kubedns. So this is not that dangerous operation, because your application will still be able to work, and those pods will be restarted immediately, and it will reload the new config map configuration. Now if I do get pod from that namespace, I will see that those pods actually are now running. So from now on, I should be able to retest again that custom domain name. So I'll reuse my same nginx test pod in order to resolve the custom domain name for aks.com. Let's do that. And yes, now we can view the response coming from our nginx container. Great, so this means that any pod can use actually this custom domain name to resolve the service name that we have provided here. So note here, for the service name, actually the custom domain is aks.com, but I still need to provide two parameters. One is the name, service name, and the second one is the service or the namespace name, which is default here in my case. And we still have some other options for customization. Actually, if I go back here to the config map, I'll go to command this first section, rewrite stop, and then I reuse the second section right here. And note in the second section, what is different when compared with the first one is that here for the custom domain, I'm providing also the .default.sbc.cluster local. So this means that here I will need, of course, to create a rewrite stop rule for each namespace that I want to give it a custom domain name. I have done that for this aks.com. So now if I redeploy that config map using qcontrol apply, tells me it's configured. Now I should again go to delete the pods, then make sure the pods are recreated immediately, and then next we can go to resolve our custom domain name, and here instead of using .default.aks.com, here I can actually go to delete that default, and I'll use just nginx.aks.com, and that will give me the same result right here, the same response coming from the pods backed by my nginx service. So to get better insights, what we can do here is that we can go to use the DNS utils tools, and we can install it into our test nginx pod, and that's what I'm gonna do through these commands. I have already run these commands before, but you can go run apt get update and then install DNS utils, and then you will be able to use the nslookup commands like what I have here. So if I do nslookup nginx.aks.com, this will give me the DNS service that was used in order to resolve this domain name, and here it will be resolved actually to the default name service used in Kubernetes that is backed by this private IP address. And if I do Kubernetes get service, you will see that same IP. Actually, that's the IP of my service. So this means that DNS custom domain name resolution works correctly as expected. Great. We have seen the Kubernetes plugin for CoreDNS, but there are lots of other plugins. One of them is the Azure plugin for CoreDNS. This will allow CoreDNS installed inside the Kubernetes cluster to be able to manage and configure an Azure DNS. So it will use a service principal credentials in order to configure the Azure DNS. Thank you. Make sure to subscribe to my channel to get the latest videos about Kubernetes.